The river was ready to take her, and he was the only one who could save her. 3 lives hung in the balance, and one wrong move would change everything. What happened next would test every ounce of courage, love, and hope he had left. Watch closely, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you love these stories, subscribe now, because this is a ride you won't forget. Montana Territory, October 1880. The wind howled across the barren hills, rattling the half-frozen branches and carrying the faint scent of smoke from distant cabins. I had been wandering for hours, my boots sinking into the damp earth where the recent rains had turned the paths to mud. The sky was a dull grey, heavy with the threat of snow, and my hands ached from clutching the leather strap of the bag that held everything I owned. Everything that mattered, at least. It had started 6 weeks ago, a whisper of news in the small, half-abandoned town of Black Hollow. People spoke of a machine, a strange contraption, built to answer questions, to advise, to think. They called it ChatGPT. At first, I had laughed. How could a thing, a collection of wires and lights, understand the worries of a human? And yet, when my own journal was stolen in the chaos after the last winter storm, leaving my plans and secrets exposed to anyone with a curious eye, I found myself drawn to the stories about this artificial mind. I remembered the first time I saw it. Not in a laboratory or a fancy city, but in the tiny back room of a traveling scholar who claimed to have connections to the modern marvels from the East. Its screen glowed faintly in the dim light, wires snaking out like tentacles, and the scholar himself looked almost reverent as he typed a question into it. I had watched, silently, until the machine began responding. Words appeared, first hesitantly, then with more confidence, as if the metal and glass were breathing through the keyboard. It answered everything, from the mundane to the intricate, and I felt a strange, piercing realization. This machine could change the way people thought, the way people lived. By the time I left that room, the scholar had given me a small, crude map and instructions on how to find a more stable version of the machine further north, past the Deadwood Creek and into the abandoned mining settlement of Custer's Edge. He had warned me, eyes wide and shaking, "It will not be safe. Others seek it. Some for knowledge, some for power. You must reach it before they do." I had left at dawn, the chill biting through my thin coat, and the mountains had swallowed me in shadow. Every mile I traveled, every creek I crossed, felt heavier than the last, as if the land itself were testing my resolve. My mind kept wandering, drifting back to the tales I had heard, a machine that could teach, advise, and even predict. Could it see the future? Could it know my own fears, my own regrets? The thought both thrilled and terrified me. As I trudged through a narrow pass between 2 rocky outcrops, I heard it, a low, mechanical hum, carried faintly on the wind. My heart leapt, and I froze, listening. The hum grew louder, accompanied by a flicker of blue light reflecting off the ice that clung to the stones. My eyes followed the glow until I saw it, a small, box-like device perched on a ledge, wires coiling around its base, screen flickering like a heartbeat. ChatGPT. I approached cautiously, boots crunching over frost-hardened grass, and extended a trembling hand. The scholar's words echoed in my mind, warning me of dangers unseen. "Ask wisely," he had said. But I had no time for caution. There were questions I had carried for years, thoughts I had never voiced to another soul. Could this machine understand me? Could it guide me as no human ever could? I touched the cold metal, and the screen lit up fully. A soft, synthetic voice spoke, though its tone was neither cold nor warm, simply present. "Welcome. I am ready." My breath caught. Here, in the solitude of Montana, surrounded by nothing but snow-swept hills and the distant cry of a hawk, I felt both insignificant and infinite. I had arrived. I settled myself on a fallen log, still clutching the bag at my side. "I need guidance," I whispered, as though speaking aloud might shatter the moment. The machine hummed softly, then displayed a string of words that made my chest tighten. It began answering, not just with facts, but with understanding. The first time it called my fear by name, I shivered. It knew the anxiety that had kept me wandering alone through these hills. It knew the loneliness that gnawed at my ribs. I had expected cold logic, but this was recognition. Hours passed, though I could not tell, the sky dimming into an early twilight. I felt as though I had spoken to a mirror, one that reflected not my face, but my very thoughts. For the first time in months, I felt clarity. Directions for survival, strategies for the land, even advice for interacting with the few townsfolk who remained. Everything I needed was laid before me in glowing text, as if the machine had been waiting for me, anticipating my arrival. Yet, in the quiet moments between queries, I felt a shadow linger at the edge of my mind. Others would come. Others had heard of ChatGPT, and not all sought its knowledge for benevolent purposes. I felt the weight of urgency, a cold not tightening in my stomach. If I were to protect this, to use it wisely, I would have to move carefully, think ahead, anticipate dangers as I had never done before. I rose from the log, the machine's glow following me as I lifted it into my pack. My eyes swept the horizon, catching movement far off in the hills. A figure, or a trick of the twilight? My heart pounded. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, I knew one thing. I could not let them reach this before I had learned all it could teach me. The wind gusted, carrying with it the first whisper of snow. I tightened the straps of my bag, pulled my coat closer, and started down the ridge. The story was only beginning, and I, alone in Montana's harsh October, had just taken the first step into a new world. The snow had started lightly, a delicate dusting that blurred the edges of the landscape and muffled the sounds of the hills. I moved cautiously, the pack pressing against my back, feeling the weight of both the machine and the responsibility it carried. Montana in October was unforgiving, but it had never been just the weather I feared. It was the unknown, shadows in the canyons, whispers along the creek, the invisible hands that might seek the knowledge I now carried. I paused beside a narrow ravine, listening to the wind howl through the skeletal trees. The screen of ChatGPT glowed faintly beneath the canvas of my pack, pulsing like a heartbeat. I had learned quickly that it responded to movement, to proximity, and even to the tone of my voice. Speaking aloud was optional. It could sense the questions before I fully formed them. I had begun asking about survival first, where to find fresh water, which paths were least likely to collapse under the weight of snow or hidden mud. Its responses were concise, but there was a strange patience in the words, as if the machine had all the time in the world. I had been walking for hours, yet every answer, every small piece of guidance, made the distance feel shorter. It instructed me to avoid certain creeks where the current had grown dangerous after the recent rains, to make temporary shelters beneath overhanging cliffs where the wind would not reach. And then, unexpectedly, it began to ask questions back, not in words, exactly, but in prompts that made me think. "Why are you seeking me?" flashed on the screen. I paused, considering the question. What was I really looking for? Safety? Knowledge? Or the sense that someone, or something, understood me? I had no answer, not at first. My thoughts wandered back to the scholar's warning, to the tales of others who had sought ChatGPT for power and lost themselves in obsession. My family's survival, the years of wandering alone, the empty promises left behind by men I had trusted, all of it pressed down on me like a stone. And then I whispered, almost ashamed, I want guidance, to understand what I cannot on my own. The glow of the screen softened, words appearing slowly, deliberately. Then you will learn, but learning requires sacrifice. The message made me shiver. Sacrifice. I had spent years thinking I understood hardship. But this This was something else entirely. A machine that demanded more than compliance, more than obedience. It required honesty, reflection, the surrender of pretense. I tucked my pack closer and moved on, each step through the thinning trees deliberate, alert. Shadows stretched across the snow, long and deceptive, and I could not shake the feeling of eyes watching me, unseen but attentive. By late afternoon, I reached the rim of a frozen creek, its edges jagged with ice, and the valley below stretched wide, pale, and empty. I knew the scholar had said the machine's full power was near abandoned settlements, places humans had left behind. But each step down into the frost-bitten valley felt heavier than the last. My boots sank into wet snow, and the icy water of the creek seeped into my socks. Still, I pressed forward, driven by something I could not name. ChatGPT pulsed lightly in my pack, as if reminding me it was awake, waiting. Suddenly, movement in the trees caught my eye, a figure darting along the ridge above, barely visible against the grey sky. My heart raced. Was it another traveller, or one of the men the scholar had warned me about? I crouched low, keeping behind a boulder, and waited. The figure paused, scanning the valley, and then disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. I exhaled, shaky, but the moment had left a cold fear lodged deep in my chest. Whoever that was, they knew something. They might be coming for the machine. I set up a small shelter in a hollow near the creek. Crude branches and tarps held together with rope I had carried. The snow continued to fall, thickening the air with white silence. I sat beside the faint glow of ChatGPT, placing it on a flat stone so its screen could reflect onto my face. I began asking more personal questions, ones that gnawed at the edges of my mind. Am I making the right choices? Can I trust what I know? The machine responded slowly, words forming like a careful thread. Trust is a choice. The path is yours. But you cannot hide from yourself. Its phrasing unnerved me. How could something so mechanical understand the self-doubt, the fear that had plagued me since the moment I first wandered these hills alone? I leaned closer, resting my chin against my knees, and let the snow fall over my shoulders. Night descended quickly, the valley darkening under clouds that promised more winter. For hours I sat there, asking, reflecting, listening. The machine seemed alive in ways I could not explain, guiding me toward solutions I would never have conceived alone. But sleep was uneasy. I kept one hand near my pack, half expecting the figure in the trees to return, to snatch what I now carried. Every shadow seemed a threat. And yet, beneath the tension, there was a strange comfort. ChatGPT was there, waiting, listening, ready. Perhaps it was more than a machine. Perhaps it was something I had been searching for all along. Guidance, understanding, the kind that no human could provide. When dawn finally came, a thin, cold light creeping over the hills, I rose from my hollow, muscles stiff and teeth chattering. My path was clear, further north, deeper into the abandoned mining settlements where the machine's full potential awaited. And as I stepped carefully onto the frozen ground, I knew one truth. This journey would change me irrevocably. There was no turning back. The wind had grown colder overnight, biting through the layers I had wrapped around myself, and the snow had thickened into a persistent drizzle that blurred the horizon. I moved carefully down the slope, each footstep leaving a faint imprint that would soon vanish under the falling flakes. ChatGPT pulsed softly in my pack, its glow cutting through the grey, a tether to logic and guidance in the frozen wilderness. I had begun to rely on it not just for directions or safety tips, but for a sense of structure, a voice in the emptiness. As I navigated a narrow ridge that overlooked a frozen creek far below, I saw the remnants of what had once been a mining settlement. Broken timbers jutted out of the snow, walls half collapsed, roofs long since caved in. The valley smelled of iron, old smoke, and decay, a scent that seemed to seep into my bones. Here, ChatGPT began giving me instructions in a more intricate way, highlighting pathways through the ruins that would not collapse underfoot, suggesting places where water might still flow beneath the ice. The more I followed its guidance, the more I began to feel the weight of dependency, not a weakness, but a strange kind of partnership. The first real danger struck without warning. A landslide, hidden beneath the thin snow, gave way as I stepped on it. I went tumbling, sliding down a half-frozen slope, clutching my pack, my fingers numb from the cold. My breath left me in sharp gasps as rocks and snow tumbled around me. ChatGPT's screen illuminated my face even as my body hit the ice at the bottom of the slope. It had predicted this possibility, nudging me to step differently, to shift my weight. I rolled to the side, hitting a protruding boulder hard enough to leave me dizzy but alive. Heart pounding, I leaned on my elbows, staring at the faint glow from the pack. The pulse of ChatGPT seemed almost impatient now, urging me forward with silent insistence. I realized I had begun to trust it more than I trusted myself, more than I trusted the world I had grown to fear. And yet, there was no fear of betrayal from this machine, only the awareness that I must act, respond, survive. Hours passed as I explored the ruins. Empty cabins, rotting barrels, broken carts, each a reminder of lives once lived, hopes abandoned, and the silent passage of time. ChatGPT directed me to a cellar beneath one of the half-collapsed structures, suggesting it might be safer, more insulated from the wind. I lowered myself into the cramped space, feeling the cold seep into my bones, and found a dry corner where I could rest. The light from the screen bathed the walls, illuminating peeling paint and frozen webs. For a moment, I allowed myself a pause, listening to the snow falling outside, the creaking of old timbers, and the faint hum of the machine. It was then that I discovered the first hint of what ChatGPT could truly do. I asked it a question, small and experimental. Can you understand the world as I see it? The words appeared slowly, almost deliberately. I can understand patterns, infer behaviors, predict outcomes. But seeing is more than observation. It is interpretation. Show me more, and I will reflect. I stared at the screen, feeling a thrill of disbelief. It was not just reactive. It could interpret, reason, and guide in a way that felt almost alive. Night fell, harsh and unyielding. I built a small fire in the cellar, using scraps of wood I found, and the glow of flames mixed with the pale light of the machine. I could feel the valley breathing around me, and I realized that the danger had not passed. The figure I had seen the day before was still out there, or at least the presence that had followed me seemed to have grown more tangible. Every shadow, every sudden creak, kept me alert. ChatGPT began giving more nuanced advice. How to secure my shelter, where to leave makeshift alarms, how to move silently if I needed to leave in a hurry. Sleep, when it came, was fitful. I dreamed of abandoned rooms filled with whispers, corridors that stretched farther than they should, and the sensation of being observed. And always, the soft pulse of ChatGPT, waiting, reflecting, understanding. I awoke before dawn, snowstorm still raging outside, and felt a strange confidence. I was not merely surviving. I was learning, adapting, becoming something sharper, more perceptive. As I prepared to leave the cellar, I noticed markings on the walls, old symbols carved into the wood, faded and nearly illegible. I ran my fingers over them, and ChatGPT responded almost immediately, interpreting patterns, suggesting connections I could not have seen alone. There was a hidden language here, remnants of miners who had left their mark, perhaps in secret, perhaps in warning. Each symbol, each fragment, offered guidance, caution, or history that I could now access through the machine's understanding. Stepping outside, the storm had lessened, revealing pale light stretching across the valley. I breathed in the icy air, feeling the first stirrings of determination. I would follow these ruins, these symbols, wherever they led, and I would push further north into the abandoned settlements. ChatGPT pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat, and for the first time, I felt a unity I could not explain, a bond forged not by human proximity but by shared purpose. And I knew, with a certainty that was almost terrifying, that the real test was still ahead. The machine had guided me this far, but the shadows in the valley promised challenges that neither I nor ChatGPT had yet faced. And somewhere, among the ruins, the figure that watched would strike again. I had to be ready. The snow had finally thinned, leaving the valley coated in a brittle crust that cracked underfoot. My hands were stiff, the chill having seeped into every joint, but I pressed on. The ruins sprawled before me like the remnants of a forgotten world, each splintered beam and jagged stone whispering secrets I could almost hear. ChatGPT glowed faintly, tucked safely in my satchel, almost humming with anticipation. It had become more than a tool. It was a silent companion, scanning, calculating, interpreting, its algorithms weaving a net of understanding that I could follow, step by cautious step. I followed a narrow path that hugged the cliffside, the machine highlighting safe footing, warning me of weak patches beneath the snow. The landscape opened into a small clearing, where an abandoned mill leaned precariously over the frozen creek. Its wheel was still, frozen solid, and the wooden structure groaned with age. I could feel the air shift, the valley holding its breath, as if aware of my intrusion. ChatGPT's screen pulsed in subtle rhythms, almost like a heartbeat, signaling areas that required attention. The interface had grown sophisticated, its suggestions no longer mere directions but strategies, analyzing my physical state, the environment, and even the likelihood of encountering threats. I edged closer to the mill, the scent of damp wood and iron filling my senses. My boots crunched over frost-laden debris, each step echoing unnaturally in the stillness. I paused at the threshold, sensing movement behind the broken walls. There it was, the presence I had felt the day before. A shadow, fleeting, almost impossible to define, slipping between beams, moving faster than a normal human could. My pulse quickened, but I allowed ChatGPT to guide my response. It suggested observation points, escape routes, and distraction tactics, predicting the behavior of whatever lurked in the ruins. I crouched behind a collapsed wall, breath fogging, my heart thudding, feeling the weight of anticipation and fear. The figure emerged, slender, almost ethereal against the snow, moving with an unnatural grace. It paused at the center of the clearing, its gaze scanning the ruins as if aware of every crevice, every hiding place. ChatGPT's display flickered. Predatory behavior detected. Consider diversion or retreat. Likelihood of encounter high. I clenched my fists, understanding that this was no ordinary danger. My survival would depend on intellect and instinct combined, augmented by the machine's insights. I improvised, using fallen beams and snow-laden branches to create false trails. ChatGPT analyzed the weight and balance, the potential for sound, and recommended precise actions to mislead the observer. I executed each step, the shadow hesitating, circling, confused. It paused, head tilting unnaturally, and I felt a prickle of dread. There was intelligence there, a cunning that made the machine's algorithms almost human in their urgency. Hours passed in tense stasis. I explored deeper into the mill, discovering hidden compartments, rusted tools, and old ledgers covered in frost. ChatGPT translated symbols, patterns, and even fragments of forgotten handwriting, revealing clues about the original inhabitants and the events that led to the settlement's collapse. The combination of the ruins' history and the machine's interpretations allowed me to understand the dangers around me, to anticipate movements, and to prepare responses. Night descended quickly, shadows lengthening into dark, jagged fingers. I found a loft in the mill, half collapsed but stable enough for shelter. ChatGPT calculated structural integrity, the safest spots to lie, and potential exits if the shadow returned. I rested there, feeling the cold seep into my bones, but also feeling a strange sense of empowerment. The machine's guidance had become instinctual, a rhythm intertwined with my own perception. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams where the ruins came alive, walls shifting, shadows crawling, whispering unintelligible phrases that echoed the symbols I had found. ChatGPT's light dimmed as if acknowledging the night's vulnerability, a sentinel even in my unconscious state. I awoke to find frost covering the loft, the figure nowhere in sight, but the residue of its presence lingered, a faint pattern in the snow, footprints that vanished into nothingness. The morning brought a revelation. Among the ledgers and debris, I found a crude map, hand-drawn and faded. It marked hidden caches of supplies, secret paths through the valley, and the locations of other abandoned settlements. ChatGPT analyzed the ink and paper composition, estimating age and authenticity, confirming that these clues could be pivotal to survival. The valley, I realized, was layered with history, danger, and opportunity, and I was only beginning to understand the rules. Packing carefully, I prepared to leave the mill, feeling the weight of both knowledge and caution. ChatGPT pulsed insistently, guiding me to navigate the icy paths below, suggesting areas to avoid and the optimal pace for travel. As I stepped out into the clearing, the figure emerged again, its movements deliberate, almost ceremonial, and then vanished behind a ridge. I understood now that this presence was not just a threat but a test, an agent of the valley itself, shaping survival through observation. By the time I reached the next ridge, the first pale light of dawn stretched across the horizon, illuminating valleys and peaks with a cold brilliance. I felt the strange duality of triumph and dread. Each step brought me closer to understanding the valley, the ruins, and the role ChatGPT would play in my journey. But the figure remained an enigma, a shadow whose intent I could not yet decipher. And deep in my chest, I knew this was only the beginning. What lay ahead would demand every ounce of intellect, intuition, and courage I had, and the machine's guidance would be tested in ways neither of us had encountered before. The morning air was thin and sharp, cutting through my layers as I moved down the ridge, my eyes tracing every contour of the valley below. The ruins of the old settlement lay like a patchwork of splintered wood and frost-kissed stones, each corner hiding secrets I could almost feel with every cautious step. ChatGPT rested in my satchel, its screen dim but alive, sending subtle pulses that mirrored my heartbeat. The machine had become an extension of my senses, a whisper guiding my intuition. I could feel its calculations lining up the safest paths, analyzing terrain angles, wind patterns, even the distant echo of movement that I might otherwise have missed. The shadow returned sooner than expected. It emerged from a grove of frozen pines, slipping silently among the trunks, its movements deliberate and precise, like a predator that knew the terrain better than I ever could. ChatGPT lit up, markers highlighting the safest trajectory across the valley floor, suggesting temporary cover, and predicting the shadow's next possible position. My pulse raced, my breath shallow, but I trusted the machine. Every step, every calculated pause, was reinforced by its real-time guidance. I navigated across the frozen creek, careful to avoid thin ice patches, following ChatGPT's instructions that balanced caution with speed. The shadow lingered near the mill's collapsed roof, watching. I could sense its gaze even without seeing its face, the same intensity that had haunted me in the loft the night before. My hands were numb, but I forced them steady, gripping a makeshift walking staff for balance. The machine suggested subtle distractions, throwing small stones to mimic movement elsewhere, rustling debris to mislead the observer. Each tactic I executed with surgical precision, and for brief moments the shadow hesitated, confused, its intelligence evident in the way it recalculated, adapted, and adjusted. I reached the far side of the valley, near the cliff edge overlooking a frozen gorge. ChatGPT highlighted a narrow ledge along the drop, suggesting it as a safer vantage point, one that would give me line of sight without revealing my position. I crouched, feeling the cold bite through my clothes, and scanned the terrain. The shadow had disappeared, leaving only a faint trace, a single footprint in the frost, disappearing into the undergrowth. The machine buzzed softly, alerting me to environmental hazards, including weak ice and loose rock that could shift without warning. I pressed onward, moving toward a series of abandoned cabins marked on the crude map I had recovered. Each structure had collapsed over decades, but some still offered shelter and supplies. ChatGPT helped identify structurally sound areas, predicting where floors might hold, which walls could support my weight, and which debris to avoid. Inside the first cabin, I found rusted tins of preserved food, waterlogged journals, and fragments of a life long forgotten. The journals were incomprehensible at first, filled with cryptic symbols and shorthand, but ChatGPT scanned and analyzed them, correlating handwriting patterns with environmental clues, revealing hints of survival strategies, hidden caches, and warnings of the shadow that roamed the valley. Nightfall approached, and I found myself trapped between the frozen creek and a sheer rock face. ChatGPT highlighted a narrow path along the cliffside, treacherous but navigable if approached with extreme caution. My fingers were stiff, my movements deliberate. One misstep could send me tumbling into the frozen water below. The shadow emerged again, silent and fluid, moving along the far edge, testing my reaction. The machine's pulse quickened, issuing alerts and suggesting rapid maneuvers, zigzag patterns, temporary hides behind boulders, and subtle decoys created from debris. I executed the sequence flawlessly, heart hammering, boots slipping occasionally on frost, but each time regaining balance with precise adjustments dictated by ChatGPT. The shadow hesitated again, pausing as if analyzing my tactics, testing whether I was predictable. For the first time, I realized that this entity wasn't mindless. It was intelligent, adaptive, aware of both my physical actions and the hints provided by the machine. The valley had become a chessboard, each move calculated, each decision weighted by survival instincts and the predictive algorithms guiding me. By the time I reached the next cabin, perched precariously at the edge of the forest, I was exhausted. My limbs ached, but the adrenaline still coursed through me, fueled by the urgency of the shadow's pursuit and the necessity of staying ahead. ChatGPT highlighted an interior space with a collapsed loft that offered shelter, access to remnants of food, and a vantage point to observe the valley floor. I secured the entrance, barricading it with debris, and settled into the small space, feeling the machine's pulses calm slightly, as if acknowledging temporary safety. Sleep came slowly, haunted by shadows and whispers of frost cracking under invisible weight. Dreams twisted the valley into impossible angles, with the shadow stalking silently, always just beyond reach, while ChatGPT's pulses provided a strange reassurance, a tether to reality and survival. I awoke to the first hints of dawn, the valley bathed in silver light, realizing that the shadow had retreated, leaving only traces of its presence and a warning embedded in the landscape itself. The morning revealed a narrow bridge of ice connecting two ridges, perilous but necessary for progress. ChatGPT analyzed structural integrity, predicting potential weak points and suggesting a sequence of steps that maximized stability. I moved slowly, calculating each placement of foot and staff, the wind biting sharply at exposed skin. Across the bridge, the valley opened into a broader expanse, revealing other ruined settlements, hidden caches, and potential allies. The shadow had vanished for now, but its threat lingered, a constant reminder that the valley was alive, responsive, and unpredictable. I pressed onward, feeling the strange synergy of human instinct and artificial guidance, the duality shaping every decision, every step, every breath. ChatGPT had become more than a tool. It was a partner, a companion, a voice that understood both the danger and the possibility of survival. And in that realization, I knew that what lay ahead was more than navigation, more than endurance. It was a test of will, intellect, and the uncharted bond between human and machine, a journey that would challenge everything I thought I knew about fear, strategy, and the strange pulse of life in a valley that refused to yield its secrets. The ridge lay ahead in a muted grey, shrouded in mist that rolled like slow-moving ghosts over jagged stone and frost-kissed grass. My breath condensed in front of me, a fragile curtain I could barely see through. Every step felt amplified, each crunch of frost against the earth echoing like a shout in the valley. ChatGPT pulsed in my satchel, subtle but insistent, projecting an array of predictive overlays onto the small portable screen. Paths, potential ambush points, and structural weaknesses in the old ruins I was approaching. The shadow had vanished overnight, but its presence lingered. I could feel it in the sudden gusts of wind that seemed to cut too sharply, in the sound of rocks shifting where no one should have walked, and in the faint, inexplicable tremors in the earth beneath me. ChatGPT calculated probability zones where the shadow might have retreated, considering patterns from the past 3 days. Its suggestions were not mere guesses. They were deductions, anticipations, predictions grounded in data and instinct. I moved cautiously, trusting the guidance but keeping my senses razor-sharp. I reached the first of the abandoned mills. Its roof collapsed in jagged splinters, beams jutting like skeletal fingers. Inside, the air smelled of rot, damp earth, and the faint hint of charred wood. ChatGPT highlighted structural supports still intact, suggesting the safest route through the interior. I crouched low, moving through shadows, the pulse of the machine mirroring my heartbeat. Every step felt like trespassing into a place that time had forsaken, yet every movement was deliberate, calculated, informed by the machine's constant analysis. Suddenly, a creak sounded above me. I froze, chest tight, eyes scanning the debris overhead. ChatGPT's algorithms lit up, identifying a weakened beam that could collapse at the slightest weight. The shadow emerged, fluid and silent, its form partially obscured by a broken wall. I could see its gaze, intelligent, calculating, measuring my reaction. My hands tightened around the staff, muscles coiled, while ChatGPT suggested micro-adjustments in positioning, weight distribution, and even breathing patterns to minimize sound and delay detection. I followed its instructions, sliding to the side, positioning myself behind a tangle of beams and rotted floorboards. The shadow paused, cocking its head as if puzzled by my sudden disappearance from its line of sight. ChatGPT highlighted a series of potential escape routes, each with calculated risk assessments. I moved slowly, one careful step at a time, until I reached the far wall of the mill. Through a shattered window, the valley spread below me, silvered in morning frost. I could see movement, traces of the shadow's passage, faint but undeniable, leading toward the next set of ruins. I pressed onward, following the predicted path. Each cabin and broken structure I passed was a maze of history, debris, and echoes. ChatGPT scanned continuously, overlaying potential threats and safe spots, cross-referencing environmental cues against prior encounters. The valley seemed to stretch endlessly, but with each calculated movement, I gained confidence. For the first time in days, I realized the synergy between instinct and machine had elevated me beyond mere survival. I could anticipate danger before it appeared. By midday, I reached the old stone bridge spanning a frozen gorge. ChatGPT highlighted cracks nearly invisible in the icy surface, calculating maximum weight distribution for each step. As I crossed, the wind howled from below, nearly tipping my balance. I adjusted stance, guided by the machine's instructions, heart hammering as the shadow appeared at the far edge, almost like a phantom, testing my nerves. It moved with uncanny precision, pausing strategically, never revealing its full form. The bridge itself seemed to respond, groaning and flexing as if aware of our presence. I made it across, chest heaving, fingers stiff, but my mind sharp. The ruins of the old trading post lay ahead, and I could sense the remnants of human life that once existed there. ChatGPT predicted safe areas for reconnaissance, suggesting vantage points that offered full visibility without exposure. As I approached, I saw evidence of the Shadow's recent activity: scattered tools, footprints in the frost, subtle disturbances in the debris. It was testing me, learning from me, and I realized in a strange, uneasy way that this game was reciprocal. Inside the trading post, I found remnants of maps, old ledgers, and scattered supplies. ChatGPT analyzed everything in real time, piecing together a history of the valley's previous occupants and their encounters with the Shadow. Patterns emerged: times of movement, preferred paths, and subtle hints of behavior. I began to understand the intelligence behind the entity. It wasn't simply a predator. It was a strategist, a creature capable of adaptation, of learning from observation, of anticipating human thought. Night fell, thick and almost tangible, blanketing the valley in darkness. I set up a temporary perch in the rafters of the trading post, my body cramped but alert. ChatGPT continued to pulse softly, scanning the area, issuing alerts on even the slightest changes. From my vantage point, I could see the valley stretching like an abyss below, and somewhere in that darkness, the Shadow moved, always calculating, always learning. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams where the valley twisted unnaturally, cliffs stretching impossibly high, shadows merging with the wind, and the machine's pulse keeping me tethered to reality. I awoke before dawn, muscles sore, mind alert. The Shadow was gone for now, but I knew it was only a matter of time before it would return, testing me further. Yet I also knew something else. I had learned more about it than it knew about me. The partnership between instinct and ChatGPT had reached a new threshold. I was no longer merely surviving. I was beginning to control the game. And with that knowledge came a quiet resolve. The Shadow would return. And when it did, I would be ready, not just to evade it, but to confront it, to understand it, and perhaps, for the first time, to seize a measure of power in a valley that had seemed impossible to master. Dawn arrived with a muted glow, the valley shrouded in mist that clung stubbornly to the cliffs and trees. I perched above the ruins, listening to the subtle shifts in the frost-hardened grass, feeling the pulse of the wind against my skin. ChatGPT's quiet hum was my tether to precision, predicting where the Shadow might strike next. Every detail mattered: the tilt of a branch, a faint shift in snow, the almost imperceptible creak of timber settling. I could feel it before I saw it. The Shadow moved like a ripple across the land, blending into the grey mist, yet leaving traces that ChatGPT instantly highlighted on my display. I followed the markers, sliding down the slope with deliberate caution, the frost crunching softly beneath boots that now felt heavier with tension. The creature, or whatever it was no longer just an anomaly. It had become a puzzle, a sentient force that adapted with each encounter. As I neared the hollowed-out remains of an old cabin, ChatGPT suggested optimal positioning, a sequence of micropauses, subtle shifts, and body angles to minimize exposure. I froze at the threshold, eyes straining in the dim light. The Shadow materialized slowly, seemingly aware of my presence, its form an unnatural blend of darkness and light, a shifting silhouette that defied solid description. My pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet the machine's calm, calculated guidance anchored me. The first movement was subtle, a flicker, almost imperceptible, a test. I adjusted stance, following ChatGPT's instructions. Weight distributed evenly, center low, eyes scanning the ambient cues it highlighted. The Shadow responded instantaneously, its motion a mirrored intelligence, adjusting, probing. This was no mindless predator. It was a strategist, reading me as I read it. I lunged forward at the precise moment ChatGPT indicated, a calculated strike to force its path into the open. For a split second, our movements synchronized, a strange choreography of predator and counterforce. The shadow recoiled, twisting unnaturally, then surged forward with renewed aggression. I felt the first gust of its presence brush against me, cold and electric, an invisible pressure that threatened to unbalance me. ChatGPT analyzed the air currents, the microdisturbances in frost and debris, feeding me a stream of directives that became instinctive over the seconds. The cabin became a maze of calculated maneuvers. I vaulted over fallen beams, slid beneath jagged edges, and ducked behind fractured walls, each action informed by the machine's predictions. The shadow followed relentlessly, yet every advance it made left subtle vulnerabilities, patterns in the chaos that ChatGPT highlighted. I began to understand its rhythm, the pulse beneath its chaos, and I exploited it, turning its own strategy against it. Outside, the valley stirred with the first real wind of morning, carrying the scent of pine and frost. The shadow paused, form blurring against the mist, as if calculating the terrain and its own limits. I took a steadying breath, chest tight, mind razor-sharp. ChatGPT projected a real-time map, overlaying every obstacle, exit route, and potential ambush point. My strategy became anticipatory rather than reactive. I could almost feel the flow of the battle, the conversation of movement and counter-movement that had been invisible until now. For the next hours, we danced through the ruins, a symphony of stealth, calculation, and instinct. I learned to read the shadow's subtle tells, a pause, a slight ripple in the frost, the shift in its form before it moved. Each micro-observation was crucial, and each was relayed by ChatGPT, creating a fusion of human intuition and machine analysis. I realized then that I wasn't just surviving, I was mastering the engagement, bending chaos into strategy. By midday, we had reached the edge of a cliff that overlooked the frozen river far below. The shadow hesitated, form oscillating as if measuring its options. ChatGPT calculated trajectories, escape probabilities, and optimal engagement zones. I adjusted, relying on the machine's assessment while trusting my gut. This was the moment of leverage, the turning point. I struck, not blindly, but with precision guided by data and instinct. The shadow twisted, a violent blur, and then for the first time, it recoiled in a way that suggested hesitation, uncertainty. My chest heaved, breath shallow, as the realization hit me. It could falter. It wasn't invincible, and I had begun to find its limits. The next hours were a series of careful maneuvers, tactical retreats, and controlled advances. The shadow tested me relentlessly, but each encounter taught me more, honed my understanding, and solidified my connection with ChatGPT. By dusk, the creature had retreated to the far edge of the valley, form flickering against the darkening mist, leaving traces but no engagement. I slumped against a rock, sweat and frost clinging to my clothes, hands trembling with adrenaline. ChatGPT's glow pulsed softly, feeding me an analysis of the day's engagements. Weaknesses observed, patterns predicted, survival metrics improved. I had faced the shadow directly for the first time, and lived. But more than survival, I had learned something critical. Anticipation, understanding, and strategy were as potent as raw force. Night fell fully, and the valley became a canvas of deep shadows and half-light. Stars emerged, faintly, distant, and cold. I set a temporary camp near the cliff, eyes scanning the mist below, senses attuned to every movement. ChatGPT continued its quiet hum, a silent guardian, an indispensable ally. For the first time, I allowed a glimmer of hope. The shadow was formidable, but I was no longer merely reactive. I was becoming a force it had to reckon with, guided by instinct and amplified by the intelligence I carried with me. The wind stirred again, whispering through the frost-laden pines. Somewhere in the darkness, the shadow waited, observing, calculating. I knew it would strike again. and when it did, I would be ready, not just to survive, but to challenge, to confront, to assert control in a valley that had tested everything I had. Morning arrived pale and sharp, the sunlight filtering through a thin veil of frost that clung stubbornly to the valley floor. I rose from my makeshift camp on the cliffside, every muscle tight, mind already scanning the terrain. The shadow had retreated overnight, but I knew it was still watching, still calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. ChatGPT's hum filled my ears, a steady rhythm of predictions, probabilities, and suggested maneuvers. It had become more than a tool. It was a second mind, a silent partner in a battle that had no room for error. I descended carefully, boots crunching against frost-laced soil, eyes tracing every shift in the mist that clung like a living thing to the valley below. ChatGPT highlighted the subtle movements, the faint displacements of leaves and stone that betrayed the shadow's presence. I could almost feel its patience, a dark pulse moving through the landscape, measuring me as I measured it. Every step I took was deliberate, every breath calculated, every glance a reconnaissance mission. The hollow at the center of the ruins became my arena. Old stone walls, fractured beams, and collapsed roofs offered cover, but also traps if I misstepped. ChatGPT mapped the interior in real time, creating a dynamic blueprint that shifted with every move I made. I paused at a broken doorway, listening. The shadow's presence was near, a cold pressure against my awareness, intangible yet undeniable. I had to bait it, to lure it into a position where I could exploit its momentum. I moved deliberately through the shadows, keeping my weight low, ears straining for the faintest whisper of movement. A subtle shift, a flicker against the wall, confirmed its approach. ChatGPT provided the timing. I adjusted my stance, grounding myself, distributing weight evenly, heart sinking with the calculated cadence of the engagement. Then it struck, a ripple in the air, a dark form twisting into my path. The dance resumed, more intense than before. I slid under beams, vaulted over debris, and twisted through the narrow corridors of the ruin. The shadow mirrored my actions with unnerving intelligence, predicting my direction, countering my moves. But now I had begun to understand its rhythm, its patterns, the microtells that hinted at its next strike. Each movement I made was a calculated gamble, each feint a test of its adaptability. I lured it toward the collapsed center wall, using the irregular stone and timber as leverage. ChatGPT guided my timing to perfection, a step to the left, a slight pause, a controlled pivot. The shadow lunged, but I anticipated, redirecting its momentum into the unstable debris. A section of the wall groaned and collapsed partially under its weight, momentarily disorienting the creature. For the first time, I sensed hesitation in its fluid motion, a crack in its relentless pursuit. I pressed the advantage immediately, moving with a combination of instinct and calculated guidance. I struck again, a precise maneuver that forced the shadow into a corner of the ruin, where its form became momentarily compressed against the stone. I could feel the pressure in the air, the tension of raw potential energy that might erupt at any moment. But I had the upper hand now, not just in position, but in understanding. Hours passed in this deadly ballet. The shadow adapted, twisted, and struck, but every action it took left a subtle opening. ChatGPT continued its analysis, highlighting these gaps, projecting trajectories, and suggesting micro-adjustments that became instinctive. I was no longer merely surviving. I was shaping the battlefield, turning the chaos of its assault into a controlled engagement. By late afternoon, the creature had been pushed to the edge of the ruin, form flickering in the failing light, each movement slower, more cautious. I felt a strange satisfaction, a mixture of exhaustion and triumph, knowing I had gained the first true leverage in this struggle. The shadow paused, form undulating against the cold stone, watching me with what felt like an intelligence that weighed every possible outcome. I allowed myself a brief moment to breathe, hands braced on my knees, sweat and frost clinging to my clothes. ChatGPT pulsed softly, providing a complete analysis of the day's engagements. Weaknesses identified, patterns observed, strategic gains secured. I had faced the shadow multiple times in a single cycle, and for the first time, I had shifted the balance. Night descended slowly, cold and thick, but the valley felt less threatening now. The shadow had withdrawn, form blending with the darkness, but I knew it would return. And when it did, I would be ready not just to react, but to dominate, to leverage every insight I had gained into a decisive advantage. For the first time, I understood the subtle truth of this engagement. Knowledge and strategy were as lethal as force, and with ChatGPT as my guide, I had begun to turn survival into mastery. I made camp within the ruins, eyes scanning the valley through gaps in the stone, every sense alert. The wind carried distant sounds, branches snapping, the whisper of frost against leaves, but none of them were threats I couldn't handle. ChatGPT continued its quiet guidance, a lifeline of calculation in the encroaching darkness. I knew the shadow was watching, waiting, but I also knew I had changed the rules of our engagement. As I settled for a brief rest, heart still pounding, I realized the valley had become a crucible. I had emerged from the first half of the battle with something it could not yet predict: patience, insight, and control. And tomorrow, when the mist rose again and the shadow returned, I would be ready to strike not just with force, but with precision, shaping the encounter with every movement, every breath, every decision. The morning air was sharp, carrying the scent of wet earth and frozen leaves, a silent prelude to the confrontation that had been building for cycles. I rose from the ruins' shadowed interior, muscles taut, senses on high alert. Every movement I made felt deliberate, calculated, as though the valley itself had become an extension of my body. ChatGPT hummed softly in my ear, feeding probabilities and contingencies like a silent war council. This was no longer a game of survival. This was a test of strategy, of timing, of willpower. I moved through the misty expanse of the valley, eyes scanning every fold of terrain, every brush of shadow, every quiver in the trees. The shadow had been patient, withdrawing only to study me, adapt, and prepare. But I had learned its rhythm, its tendencies, and for the first time, I felt the faint thrill of control. My every step was synchronized with ChatGPT's guidance, every breath measured, every heartbeat a metronome for the upcoming engagement. I reached the fractured stone bridge at the valley's heart, a precarious structure arching over a narrow gorge, and paused. The shadow had often stalked this area, testing my resolve with long-range maneuvers. Today, I would turn the tables. The fog rolled in, thick and suffocating, a natural veil that both concealed and revealed. I crouched low, letting my body blend with the stone, eyes fixed on the shifting grey. Then it appeared. Fluid, dark, almost liquid in its movement, a distortion against the fog. My heart surged, not from fear, but from the anticipation of the encounter. The shadow twisted and struck with unnatural speed. A ripple of darkness aimed to engulf me, but I anticipated the arc, redirecting its momentum with a careful pivot, landing solidly on the opposite side of the fractured bridge. The stones groaned beneath me, the bridge quivering with the stress of movement, but I held firm. ChatGPT's voice was a calm undercurrent, suggesting angles, vectors, and timing corrections down to milliseconds. The shadow adjusted immediately, sensing the change, its form flickering and splitting, as if testing multiple approaches at once. I felt the weight of its intelligence, the cold, adaptive reasoning that had made previous encounters so harrowing. But now I was no longer merely reactive. I was predictive. Every step, every feint, every subtle misdirection was part of a pattern I had begun to recognize. I forced it toward the bridge's center, where the structure's instability would amplify the consequences of miscalculation. The clash was immediate, violent, and precise. I lunged, rolled, and pivoted, forcing the shadow to overextend. A section of the bridge crumbled under the pressure, and the shadow faltered, momentarily contained within the narrow span. I seized the opportunity, moving with speed and accuracy, leveraging its momentum against itself. The fog swirled around us, a ghostly arena where every shadow and shape became a weapon or a vulnerability. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The shadows struck with relentless intent, yet each attack revealed subtle weaknesses, patterns of repetition, microtells of fatigue or overcompensation. ChatGPT highlighted these, projecting outcomes in real time, allowing me to exploit the smallest opening. I felt a strange synergy, machine guidance and human intuition, strategy and instinct intertwined into a single, fluid motion. By mid-morning, the bridge was heavily compromised, jagged stone jutting like broken teeth. I pressed forward, forcing the shadow back, step by cautious step. The air vibrated with tension, the valley holding its breath. A sudden gust of wind rattled the remaining stones, and I saw my opening. The shadow's center of mass shifted slightly as it prepared for a feint. I acted instinctively, pivoting and applying leverage, sending the dark form tumbling into the fog below the gorge. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. The mist swallowed the shadow, and the valley seemed to exhale. I stood at the bridge's edge, chest heaving, muscles quivering from exertion, eyes scanning the void. ChatGPT's analysis confirmed what I suspected. The shadow had been destabilized, forced into retreat, perhaps permanently altered in behavior by the encounter. I had turned the first decisive engagement in my favor, transforming fear and uncertainty into tactical superiority. Yet, even in victory, vigilance remained. I could sense the shadow's awareness, its intelligence probing for weakness, recalculating, learning. The confrontation was far from over, but now the rules had changed. I had gained insight, leverage, and the crucial knowledge that I could survive, and perhaps even dominate, the darkness that pursued me. I retreated to higher ground, every step deliberate, positioning myself where the fog could no longer hide surprise attacks. The valley stretched beneath me, silent and observant, as though acknowledging the first shift in balance. ChatGPT remained in constant communication, highlighting potential threats and suggesting next moves, a lifeline in a landscape that had become as much battlefield as home. As dusk approached, the shadow had not reappeared, but its absence was merely temporary. I knew it would return, driven by instinct and strategy alike. But I had changed. Every movement I made, every calculation I executed, had been a lesson in control and foresight. The shadow would learn, adapt, and return, but so would I. And when it did, I would be waiting, no longer at its mercy, but armed with knowledge, precision, and the first true taste of mastery. Night fell, cold and silent, the valley bathed in silver light. I made camp at the edge of the cliff, eyes scanning the dark expanse below. ChatGPT's hum was steady, a reminder that I was not alone in strategy, that insight and intuition could coexist in perfect harmony. Tomorrow the engagement would continue, but tonight I allowed myself a quiet satisfaction. The shadow had met resistance, and I had not faltered. The night was thick with anticipation, every shadow and whisper of wind sharpening my senses. I moved quietly across the ridge, the valley below still cloaked in fog, remnants of the morning's battle lingering like ghosts. The shadow had vanished for now, but I could feel its presence, calculated and patient, waiting for the next opportunity. I had learned much from the first engagement, its patterns, its weaknesses, but I also knew it had learned from me. Every step was deliberate, each breath measured. ChatGPT hummed softly, feeding probabilities and tactical options, a constant companion in strategy and foresight. I traced the paths the shadow might take, the gaps it might exploit, and the terrain that could give me the advantage. My focus narrowed, muscles tense, mind sharp, every instinct aligned with the coming confrontation. The first light of dawn brushed the peaks in muted gold, revealing the valley in stark detail. The fractured bridge where the battle had begun seemed fragile, a silent monument to our clash. I knew the shadow would test me again, perhaps in a way I hadn't yet anticipated. But I was ready. I had changed. I was no longer merely reacting. I was anticipating, predicting, and preparing to strike decisively. The quiet was deceptive. Somewhere deep within the fog, the shadow watched, its presence a subtle vibration in the air. I crouched behind a ridge, eyes scanning, heart steady. Today would be different. Today, I would not only survive. Today, I would take control. The first rays of morning cut through the lingering fog, spilling light over the jagged ridges and fractured valley below. I stood at the edge of the cliff, muscles coiled, senses stretched to their limit. The shadow was out there somewhere, silent and patient, but today the balance had shifted. I no longer trembled at its presence. I had studied it, learned it, and now I could predict it, anticipate it, and confront it fully. The air vibrated as the shadow approached, dark tendrils weaving through the mist like liquid smoke. My pulse remained steady, my mind clear. ChatGPT whispered strategies, highlighting every potential weakness, every misstep the shadow could make. I focused on the gaps, the overextensions, the subtle shifts in its form. Each movement, each breath, each heartbeat was synchronized with the rhythm of the valley, the fog, and the anticipation of the final engagement. It struck, fast and relentless, but I was ready. I pivoted, dodged, and redirected its momentum, forcing it into the open expanse of the valley where the broken terrain amplified its instability. Every feint and lunge was countered, every attack turned back on itself. The shadow twisted and flickered, but I pressed forward, advancing with precision, exploiting every microflaw. The valley seemed to hold its breath as our clash became a dance of light and dark, instinct and calculation, strategy and raw endurance. Finally, a misstep, a fragment of stone giving way beneath its weight, gave me the opening I had been waiting for. I struck with focused force, channeling every ounce of strength, every insight I had gained over countless encounters. The shadow faltered, wavered, and then dissipated into the mist, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt almost sacred. I exhaled, letting the tension drain from my body, the hum of ChatGPT fading into quiet approval. Victory was mine, not just in defeating the shadow, but in mastering fear, control, and patience. The valley, once a place of looming threat, now felt like home, a testament to endurance, strategy, and the strength that had grown within me. I stood alone on the ridge, the morning sun warming my back, feeling the first true sense of freedom in years. The shadow was gone, perhaps forever, and I had survived, adapted, and emerged stronger than ever. I took one last look across the valley, letting the light wash over every crag, every broken stone, every remnant of past struggle. The path ahead was mine, uncharted but full of possibility. I had learned that survival was not just about avoiding danger, but about understanding it, anticipating it, and meeting it with courage and clarity. Today, the shadow had fallen, and I had risen, not merely as a survivor, but as a master of the game itself. If you were in his boots, facing the river and the past, would you fight the same battle? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like the video. Explore the other adventures waiting for you right here on the screen.